Good.
Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick. Welcome to another pod shoot, and I'm very happy today to speak with Daniel Feldman. I'm going to speak about, again, my favorite topic, Bitcoin mining. And I would like Daniel to introduce himself. Daniel, I don't even recall how we met. And so maybe you might remind me if you remember how we met.
Sure.
And then get in a little bit into your background, who you are, and how you got involved in both Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining.
For sure. So we met through Murray Stahl, a friend of yours. I host Bitcoin meetups in New York City, and Murray had come to speak to my group. And at the end, he said, "I got another guy to speak to your group. You got to have Jeffrey Wernick in." And so you came and gave a great speech on the history of money that the group that comes to my meetup still talk about.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's
it was
nice.
great. It was great. So my background is, I'm from Boston. I dropped out of college for a while.
Are you rooting for the Dodgers?
I am. I am. I actually sold hot dogs for 10 years at Fenway Park. So I'm a big sports guy. And
Is Bucky Dent your favorite baseball player ever?
No, he is not. He is not. Torres, Bucky Dent. That was indelibly marked in my childhood, along with the '86 loss to the Mets. So those two, and then Aaron Boone in 2003, who's now, of course, the manager of the Yankees. Anyway, so
was '86? Was that the
Mets? That was
Bill Buckner?
Yeah.
I was at that game.
Wow.
I was at that game because my lawyer was the lawyer for the family that owned the Mets. So we were at the game, and he invited me to attend it. So we were in the owner's box watching the game, and people were getting up to leave, and then I started ribbing the Mets fans, saying, it ain't over till it's over. And then a little bit later, Buckner's booting a grounded at first base, and as they say, the rest is history. So, I was actually at that game in '86.
Amazing. So I grew up in a household without a television, and so we borrowed a neighbor's television to watch that game. So I have a distinct memory of sitting on the floor in my parents' bedroom, being just devastated as a Red Sox fan, watching that game. Anyway, so I started studying. You'll see why this is relevant. But when I was in high school, a teacher came up to me and said, "I can teach you the Russian past tense in 15 seconds." So I had been studying French and was uninspired. So I started taking Russian, and I was good at it. So I went with my high school for the first time in 1987 and took a tour of the Soviet Union for a month in August of '87. And then I continued studying Russian in college, and I went to do a semester abroad there in 1991, and ended up dropping out of college. And I became the pitching coach for the Soviet national baseball team after turning down the opportunity to be the head coach of the Red Army team, because that team practiced outside of Moscow, and I wanted to be in Moscow. So I did that for a year. I left right before, and had very interesting time. I was a bodyguard for Yeltsin one day, who's missing a thumb and forefinger in one hand. And then I returned right before the coup, where Gorbachev left and Yeltsin came in. 11 years later, I was a senior enforcement attorney for the SEC, and was in New York City for 9/11. And that left an indelible mark on those of us who were there, and was looking to do something more interesting. So I moved back to Russia. I was playing professional baseball for a car company there, and I was the corporate secretary of Yukos Oil, which was the fourth largest oil company in the world. And I was hired directly by Michael Hodorkovsky, who was at that time the second richest under 40-year-old in the world behind Michael Dell. He was worth $15 billion. And he said to me, "I'm told I need you, but I don't fully understand what you're going to do. But I'll know in a year whether or not you did a good job." He was arrested 10 months later, and I spent the next 11 years working for him. happily got to see him out of prison when he came to New York City to celebrate his oldest child's 30th birthday. That was nice, a nice finishing thing. While I was working for Yukos in Russia, we used to take investors out on old Tupolev Soviet-era helicopters to our oil and gas installations in Western Siberia. And one of the photo ops that we would often take were in front of these massive gas flares. They were so big you could see them from outer space, and we couldn't even get that close to them because they were so hot. And gas is flared when you lift oil out of the ground because the byproduct is this gas, and it's not worth anything near what the oil's worth. So if you don't have the proper pipelines in place, you just burn it off. And something like $68 billion of gas is flared around the world. I think Russia's number 1, Iraq and Iran are 2 and 3, the US is 4, and I think Nigeria is 5, something like that. So these flares dotted the entire Siberian horizon. So after I was done with Yukos, I started learning about Bitcoin and realized I thought it was amazing. I read the white paper and was just blown away.
What introduced you to Bitcoin? How did you get first?
Yeah,
Bitcoin.
Yeah, there are 2 ways. One, I was out for a Valentine's dinner with my wife at Nobu downtown in New York City. I think that location's closed now. And a guy sitting next to us was on a first date. Tough first date on Valentine's Day, by the way. And he gets into an argument with his date, and she storms out. And he starts yelling at us. And the concierge comes over and says, "Is this guy bothering you?" I said, "No." I think this was around 2014. And what he's yelling at me is, "I'm going to change your life today. You need to go home tonight and buy Bitcoin." and he's going on and on about how it's going to change the world. So I did go home. I didn't buy any because it was harder to buy back then, but I started looking into it and reading more and more about it. One of my friends from my time in Russia, and a banker, was getting into Bitcoin. He started a company called Storj, Storj, that had its own coin. And I started asking him more and more questions. And that's when I decided to start hosting meetups because I needed to learn more. And I thought if I collectively learned with, the people who I liked, and we could learn together. And I realized that I'm not quite smart enough to start my own technology, but I do understand energy from my time at working at the oil company.
Mm-hmm.
And what struck me was these flare sites, mm-hmm. and what a waste that was. So I started looking into capturing the flare gas, right next to the fracking pad, and pulling up a generator and another flatbed with a shipping container full of Bitcoin miners. And then when the fracking, after 400 days, the amount of gas produced goes down, you could just move to the next fracking pad. But I couldn't get anyone interested in that idea. And unfortunately, Crusoe Energy did get people interested, and they've raised, I don't know, maybe $1 billion now, and are doing it all over the US. But I really felt like Bitcoin was just an energy currency, and that there was a way for me to get involved. So a friend of mine, Harry Suddick, again, who I met through these meetups I was hosting, who's now one of the top guys at Grid, GRIID, it's a Bitcoin mining group, told me, "Hey, you're asking a lot of questions here. Just go buy a bunch of miners, get familiar with them, and that'll answer a lot of your questions." So I went out and bought like 60 S9s, which at that time, this was the end of 2017, early 2018. I think it was about that time. Maybe it was a little later in 2018. Were very cheap because Bitcoin was down, and they were newer models that were doing better. So I got these 60 S9s. I bought them, on Craigslist, from places on Telegram. I was driving up to New Hampshire, filling up my trunk with these and bringing them back. And they were filthy. They had like fishing line in them and all sorts of bugs. But I would take them completely apart. The way it works, most of these miners, you have an intake fan on one end, exiting fan on the other end, and in the middle you have 3 chipboards that are full of the chips that are doing the searching to unlock the next block in the Bitcoin blockchain. Clean them all, and then I decided I wanted to learn how to override the operating system and put in an auto-tuning software called Brains, which finds the best frequency for each chip to make each chip more efficient on a joules or watts per terahash. And I'm not a tech guy. And I decided that I didn't want anyone's help. So I was Googling it. I was looking at YouTube videos. and it took me about 4 days to do the first one, where I overrode the operating system, changed the terahashes per second, which is how many trillion guesses per second you make to unlock the next blockchain, from about 13 and a half or 14 to 16 or 16 and a half, which on a percentage basis is a good increase, right? You end up having to pay brains, but you get free pool access if you use their auto-tuning software. So once I figured out how to do one of them, I was able to do all 60 of them. And then I have a house on Long Island, and I heated the house with it's a big house. It's like 6,000 square feet. I heated the entire house with 4 miners for that winter. And, I was probably losing money because I'm paying in, residential rates on electricity. But
Right.
For me, it allowed me to track those miners on the pool site to see the performance of each miner, how many fines the pool was getting per day, and what my percentage take was on each miner basically on a 10-minute basis. Like I'd follow it all day long. That pool was getting, let's say, 9 or 10 fines a day. You could see the block reward at that point, I think it was still 12 and a half plus transaction fees. So I was like tracking it. I then did the same for my in-laws' house in Baltimore, and until I later found a place to house them. But initially, that's how I was using them.
But why don't we step back and say, why? Can you explain a little bit about how Bitcoin is mined and how you earn a blocking reward, and also what a mining facility looks like?
Of course. And I know that you're an expert in all this stuff, so I will make sure I get it right. So the Bitcoin blockchain, each block represents approximately 10-minute window of all the transactions that have occurred in the previous 10 minutes. And that is then added to all the previous transactions that have happened on the Bitcoin blockchain, which is so great because you can go back and look at every transaction that's ever happened with Bitcoin. So the miners look to open the next block, which will close the previous block of transactions, and then create a clean sheet for the next, let's call it right now, 4,000 or 5,000 transactions.
So each person, each miner are validating transactions.
That's right. And so what they're doing is, when I say,
and how many blocks do you need to close the blockchain?
So you just close each block individually, like in every. So the way it works is the miners are trying to guess at a number or get close to that number to unlock the next block, which by definition closes the previous block.
Yeah.
And
they're guessing through the use of algorithms.
Yeah, this SHA-256 algorithm that all these chips are running. So a Bitcoin miner, you can call it an ASIC or a computer. It's a box with chips in it, no keyboard, because it's just running one algorithm over and over again, making like a brute force attack on trying to find this random number. And that number can, over time, increases in how many digits it is. And then you also, in short term, you don't always have to guess the exact number, just get very close to it. And that has to do with difficulty and how many other people how many other computers are turned on at that moment. So sometimes a block closes and opens in seconds because someone luckily gets it. Other times it could take 30 minutes. But the way the algorithm is designed is, on average, and it adjusts to make sure this happens. There are major adjustments every 2 weeks and minor adjustments within those 2 weeks. That on average, it should be found every 10 minutes. So once a block closes, those transactions are officially recognized, and they're validated, and the transfer of Bitcoin that's taken place is completed. And you can't go back. You can't change that. So you need these Bitcoin miners.
That's what I'm referring to as an immutable ledger.
An immutable ledger, right?
It's immutable. It's transparent. It's a public ledger, as you said. Everybody can track what's going on, and it's immutable. That once a transaction has been closed, it's irreversible.
Irreversible. If a transaction is ever reversed, that should be the end of Bitcoin.
Right.
because the whole point of it is that it's immutable. But one of the main points. In fact, if you know a Bitcoin wallet, you can put that wallet into a search engine, and you can look at every transaction that's ever happened in that wallet historically. So, if someone asks you to send them Bitcoin, it's an open ledger. I mean, you can see everything they've ever done.
Right. You might not know who the owner of that wallet is, but you can track the activity of the wallet.
Right. So, like, if you look at Satoshi's wallet, which probably has around 1 million Bitcoin in it, you can see he was the only one mining in the beginning, and he was getting 50 Bitcoin about every 10 minutes because that was the block reward at the time. It halves about every 4 years. And then you can see people just for fun send him Satoshis, which is that 8th decimal point of 1/100th millionth of a Bitcoin. People like to just send him random little Satoshis from time to time. But you can track really any wallet you want. And like you said, there's no name associated to it, so you don't know whose wallet it is. But some people like to track what's called whales wallets, where you look and see what major players, major holders are doing with their wallets. And you see there's not a lot of movement in those wallets generally because people are bullish long term.
Which is a unique thing about Bitcoin is that the whales, the large holders, are hodlers. They're not people.
Right.
In bear markets, they're either holding or accumulating more, but they have strong hands, not weak hands.
That's right.
They're believers.
As we say, diamond hands, right? They got those strong hands. That's right. They're believers. They're hodlers. And I think that makes Bitcoin even more scarce, right? If people are not trading it as often, that helps with the price movements. So initially, people would mine Bitcoin on their computers. Over time, when the Chinese and especially Bitmain started making specialty ASICs to mine Bitcoin, you couldn't really do it with your cards on your computers anymore. So the big breakthrough was the S9, Bitmain S9.
The evolution from CPU to GPU to ASIC machines.
Right.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the evolution? So the way I basically kind of describe it is in the beginning, especially with CPUs, but even recently with GPUs, is there were no real economies of scale associated with mining. It was not until the ASIC machines got into place that economies of scale entered the miners, and that there became a benefit for creating larger mining pools. So do you want to?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the evolution went from CPUs to graphic cards at one point. So a touch of the economies of scale came with graphic cards.
Just a little bit, yeah.
A little bit. People were pulling out these graphic cards and trying to bundle them, putting them in their basement together, and they could get a decent amount of the network by doing that. But the real changes came when the Chinese got involved and started putting out, especially the S9, which was pulling 3,000, I think, or 250 watts, something like that.
That was Antminer.
Yeah. Right, Antminer, and it was between 13.5 and 15 terahash per second. So terahash per second is how many trillion guesses to unlock the next block in the blockchain making per second. And that was a game changer. And that's when people started creating these mining farms where they would set up warehouses and they would get very hot. So you had to create these hot aisles and then bring in these cool aisles down the middle so that cool air was coming in and blowing, and you had to deal with the hot air, get it away from the chips. Otherwise, you would destroy your investment in these miners. And that's when the racking and the shelving and everyone started building these big mines. And at that point, because the block reward was still high enough and not as the amount of hash or the amount of compute on the network was still low enough, there was definitely a need for low price electricity, but the margins were big enough where you could still be mining, at 15 cents a kilowatt hour, $15 a megawatt hour. So people were searching out for cheap electricity, it was people were more looking just to set up these warehouses. Yeah. Over time, as it wasn't fully Moore's law, but as like the S15s, the S17s, and then the S19s came along, and these farms got huge, especially in China, you had to get below 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and then below 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And then they started setting up hosting facilities where companies like Compute North would set up these, shipping containers, one after the other, and had open bays for people to come in, and they would upcharge you, 2 cents a kilowatt hour, but you would run your own mines. And then initially, when you talk about the formation of pools, mining pools, you could mine on your own initially and expect to get a block reward. I don't know, even if you got one once a week or once a month, that was valuable. But it became so competitive that you could spend money on your setup and not find the block reward for years. So to even out your revenue, you would join as many people would join the pool. Let's just say 10,000 or 100,000 other miners, and you would put all your compute together on one mining pool that was managed by, it was initially typically Chinese companies, that would, if any one of you found the block reward, it would be divided pro rata by how much compute you added to the pool in that interval.
Mm-hmm.
And that allowed you to even out your revenue stream. So you wasn't so bouncy. You find one block 1 month and then no blocks for 3 months. You would find blocks every day, get a small portion of it, and build it that way. And so now you have, there are, I don't know, 5 or 6 dominant pools. You have, I think the dominant one, right? It was all in China. And when China shut down their mining, most of mine moved to the US, and a lot of pools started opening here. So I think Foundry, which is a US company, controls about 30% of the network, meaning 30% of the mining computers run their miners through the Foundry pool. Another 20% are with Ant Pool, which is China-based. Another 8% are with the F2 pool in China. Another, let's see, there's Luxor, which has about 3% in the US, but via BTC has 10% out of China. So China still has most of the control over the pools, but a decent amount now is run in the US, and I hope that happens, that more and more comes to the US. So that's how pools generally work. Pools.
I met Jihan Wu.
Yeah.
So a lot of people thought that. Well, I've met, when there was the quote big fork, between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. Then subsequently we had Craig Wright's Bitcoin Satoshi vision.
Yeah.
But since he's been deemed a fraud, then maybe the concept of it being Satoshi vision is also a fraudulent concept. But I met Jihan Wu when both of us were invited by the exchange Wabi. Wabi was considering to do its own public chain, so they wanted to have supposedly a panel of experts to make a judgment. They had I think like 5 people, 5 entities come up with their own idea of why they should be chosen to build a public chain for Wabi. And so they they invited 5 people to be the judges. Jihan Wu was one of the judges, and I was as well. And of course, Jihan Wu and Roger Ver were the biggest advocates for Bitcoin Cash. I was known as being a strong advocate for Bitcoin. People expected there to be fireworks when we got together. So we ended up having a lunch, just the 2 of us, and a third person, to the extent that maybe who thought that wasn't really sure how good his English might have been, who came along with me in case I needed any translation. And we took a nice photo together, and we had a very nice conversation. I basically, I think I basically broke the ice, and I said, because I basically called them all scammers. So I was adamant against, when what was called the block size wars, against, I considered the Bitcoin Cash people all scammers. and I was very outspoken about that. And he was aware that I was of his attitude towards Bitcoin Cash, but I broke the ice and I just basically said, you're a scammer. I know you're a scammer. Let's talk about something else other than Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash. He laughed, and then we just had a nice, very, very pleasant conversation. And then when we got together to choose a project that was the best project, I basically was able to organize all the judges to basically go back and tell Wabi the smartest thing for Wabi to do was not to do a public chain at all. So, and Wabi ended up abandoning the project. I don't know if they regret it or not regret it. Maybe it was bad advice on my part, but I was able to convince the entire panel. I met Roger Ver in Korea, in South Korea, when I spoke at a conference there. I went to speak with him because I wanted to have a conversation with him, and he ghosted me. He was not interested in having a conversation with me.
Well, that's not the first time that's happened to you. I know you're outspoken. So 2 follow-ups to that. One, your friend Murray Stahl has always been a big fan of Bitcoin Cash, so we have to talk to him about that. And 2, while I'm a fan of this guy, I know you've confronted him with the same way of talking about a scam, Alex Mashinsky of Celsius. I know you spoke to him after one of his talks, and you were never a fan of his. I do like.
Oh, I was really. But he gave it. I spoke on a conference after a conference. One is I always told him when I met with Alex, and Alex was trying to convince me that Celsius was good for Bitcoin. I said, look, you're going to crash and burn, and you're not going to be good for Bitcoin because you're going to crash and burn. So if you think you're helping Bitcoin adoption, one is Bitcoin doesn't need your help to be adopted. So first thing is it doesn't need your help. So second thing, you're not even going to end up helping. But you'll help in a certain way. You'll help in demonstrating how resilient Bitcoin is to you crashing and burning. So that you're not going to help Bitcoin adoption through your success because you're not going to have success. So in the short run, it might be a negative impact, but long term, it'll be a good because you'll just show how resilient Bitcoin is to scamming operations like your attempt at DeFi, which is not really DeFi, it's CeFi, it's centralized finance, it's not decentralized finance. And then I spoke after him at a conference in New York, where he was trying to explain how Celsius was better than a bank. I was supposed to speak about another topic. I was so pissed. You have a responsibility. You get there, and unlike other people who spoke at conferences, I didn't have a business. So I was not trying to promote, do business with Jeffrey Wernick because I didn't want to do business with anyone. I didn't want anybody doing business with me, and I didn't want to do business with anyone else. So I was not doing it for any commercial reason, and I didn't have social media, so I was not attempting to be an influencer in the sense of building an influencer model. My interest was just education. So, I'm passionate about Bitcoin. I'm passionate about what Bitcoin represents. And I knew there were a lot of people providing a lot of bad information. And I wanted to be there to call people out on their bullshit. And given the fact that I had no conflict of interest, it was easy for me to call people out on their bullshit. And I was not scared of calling people out on their bullshit. So I got so irritated with his talk. He sat down to begin to listen to my talk. And I prefaced my talk saying, I'm supposed to talk about something else, but I can't leave you with the impression of what you've heard from Alex Mashinsky, that you actually believe this bullshit he's saying. So I went off and counting all the ways he was bullshitting. He got up and left. So, and I think he was a reasonably smart guy. So I got to assume that he really knew he was bullshitting and he was acting as a salesperson. So, yeah. At least that's my opinion. And it really pissed me off.
No, you're a great advocate for Bitcoin, and I agree with the things you say. I do like Alex, but I also found the irony in that Celsius's motto was "unbank yourself,"
right? Where
you're not unbanking yourself. Not your key, not your coin. They were creating a bank, and as you said, it was CeFi, not DeFi, which means you are banking yourself. You're not unbanking yourself. And what's interesting in terms of our topic today is, in many ways, the downfall of Celsius had to do with Bitcoin mining. They went out and acquired 40 to 60,000 S19 Bitmain miners without having assured place to run them. And at that time, the prices for these miners, and they were, about 96 terahash per miner, and the price per terahash was anywhere between 80 and $100. And they went out and bought 40 to 60,000 of them. The housing they thought they had lined up fell through, so they were stuck because I think they had borrowed the money to buy those miners and nowhere to run them. And that's been a common story in the Bitcoin kind of mining field, is whenever there's a run in Bitcoin, everyone gets crazy. The price of the miners goes way up. Everyone goes to acquire miners, and then they're stuck with them in their warehouse because they don't have anywhere to run them because they can't find cheap electricity. They can't find the open bays in for hosting sites. And I think in this evolution, hopefully people have learned, since that where we are with Bitcoin now, I think the hosting concept is dead. So with Bitcoin mining, a lot of companies started setting these hosting agreements. The margins aren't really there anymore to do, I think, large scale hosting. People have to find their own sites and their own places to mine. The prices have really changed. 2.5, 3 years ago, S19s for immediate delivery in the US were as high as $115 a terahash for, let's call it a 96 terahash machine. Those same machines now cost $1 to $2 a terahash. And they were like 30 joules or 30 watts per terahash efficiency. The machines now, the newest ones, let's say the S21s, XPs, are like 13 joules per terahash efficiency. They cost between $20 and $27 a terahash, which is an amazing kind of statement. So at the height of the S19 popularity, they cost upwards of over $100 a terahash. Right now, the top machines cost between $20 and $27 a terahash. So the pricing is way down, but the problem is you can't mine at 7 to 10 cents and expect to be profitable. You have to be probably below 4.5 cents, maybe even below 4 cents a terahash. If you want to, and then you're not going to make a lot of money, and you're waiting for the next jump in Bitcoin. So the way that miners make money is, hash rate, or the number of miners out there in the market's increasing. So you're making a little bit less money because you're getting a pro rata share of the daily rewards. So what you're hoping is at some point, the price of Bitcoin jumps so fast that the number of miners mining can't catch up and can't turn on quick enough to catch that jump, so that your margins increase and for a period of 6 months or a year, that you can really make big money. And the two examples I have of that are the easy one, and it's it's a little bit it does not a perfect example of what I said, but when China banned mining, and basically in one day 40% of the miners turned off. So anyone who was mining at that point, without doing anything different, made 40% more that day and for months after that. I think, and then the other example is I set up a mine at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. So I bought the miners on October 8th, 2020. They arrived January 22nd of 2021. In that period of time, Bitcoin jumped to the point where I could have sold my miners for 3 times what I paid for them on the day I got them. And we paid back the CapEx we spent inside of 4 months. Now, if you were to buy miners, you're probably looking at a 2 to 2 1/3 year payback period, unless Bitcoin jumps. And if you're getting into mining, you're hoping that Bitcoin goes on the next bull run and you're already in place. And there's 2 ways that you capitalize on that. 1, your margins improve drastically as a miner. And 2, you sell your setup, right? Because people will try to chase that bull run, and those are the guys who get burned, right? The people who take all of their Bitcoin earnings from mining and immediately put it back into more miners often get caught with their pants down, right? Because profits level off or go down, or your machines become obsolete. So timing is super, super important in Bitcoin mining. You have to get, there's some luck involved in terms of when you buy your machines, where you're turning them on, and then what is happening to the Bitcoin price, right? So profitability basically has to do with network difficulty, means how many other people are mining with you, the price of Bitcoin, the block reward, right? Because when there's a halving, that changes, and then transaction fees, Right now, transaction fees add 5, 6, 7% to your reward. They add, every block reward is 3.125 Bitcoin right now, and you get another 0.15, 0.2 Bitcoin on average for the transaction fees. And transaction fees at some point, so when they started out with Bitcoin mining, or it was $50 a block reward. 4 years later, it was 25. 4 years later, 12.5. 4 years later, 6.25, and now it's 3.125. There's an inverse relationship that has to happen with transaction fees and Bitcoin mining, and it also has to do with price. But over time, as the block rewards go to closer and closer to zero, and the last block reward will be awarded in 2140, transaction fees have to incentivize the miners to continue validating all the transactions. Because if miners aren't incentivized to validate the transactions, there could be very few miners, and then they can manipulate the market. So you need enough miners out there who can validate transactions that are incentivized to do so, to spend the money on the computers, to spend the money on the space, and to pay the high electricity bills. Electricity is about 85% of your OpEx of running a Bitcoin mine. So at some point, transaction fees have to go up, not necessarily on a per Bitcoin basis, but if Bitcoin is $1 million, you don't need a lot of Bitcoin to incentivize the miner. But if Bitcoin stays where it is now at 67,000, you're going to need more and more Bitcoin to incentivize the miners to keep going and pay these high electricity bills and compete for, to validate all the transactions. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's the incentive why people feel comfortable. And some people ask, what will happen, in 2140? With 2140, the assumption is, as you've correctly stated, is the fact that there's going to be so much value. If there's no value by 2140, there's no value, then the whole thing could implode and end up being, not necessarily worthless, but maybe essentially worthless. But if there's a lot of value, there, there'll be incentives for people to preserve the value. And the only way they'll be able to preserve the value is by rewarding people for continue to preserve value, which means they'll have to pay transaction fees to do so. And the incentive will be to pay transaction fees, because nobody is going to want to, people have a choice. Either I pay some level of transaction fees, and if the market is competitive enough, I will be paying reasonable transaction fees, reasonable enough so that it's not too expensive to engage in transactions. Adoption will be big enough, broad enough, and Bitcoin will be worth a lot, that as a percentage of the transaction dollar amount, that it'll be a very small amount for transacting. So therefore it'll be, reasonable to transact relative to other transacting in other quote currencies. And the people who own Bitcoin will be happy to pay a reasonable amount of transaction fees, because that's how value will be preserved on the network. And the incentive for them will be to preserve the value in the network, because there'll be a very valuable network. So when people ask, what will happen in 2140, you can rely upon people's, economic theory to work, is that when people have something of value, they spend money to protect its value. So people are accustomed to spending money to preserve something that's very valuable. And Bitcoin, if it's very valuable, still very valuable, and a lot more valuable in 2140 than it is today, then it'll be easy to justify business models where people will facilitate transactions, charge transaction fees, and they will continue to do the work of preserving the ledger and validating transactions and providing Bitcoin a secure environment, because everybody's incentive alignment. And that's why I've described, over and over again, is I think Bitcoin is the greatest example of Adam Smith's invisible hand. So it's a completely decentralized network. There is no controlling authority, and people have decided. If you take a look at, they say that people to earn block rewards, people are not cooperating; they're competing to earn block rewards. So here you have a completely competitive market for people spending money to earn a block reward. They're setting up and investing in all the equipment that you did with the objective of of earning block rewards. And so people are volunteer. They're everyone who is supporting Bitcoin essentially is a volunteer. There's no one out there recruiting people saying, "Hi, I'm Mr. Bitcoin or Mrs. Bitcoin, and come work for me and and block." No, everybody's volunteering and saying, "Hey, this Bitcoin thing is pretty cool. I want to be part of this. I read the white paper. I find it very compelling, and so I want to participate. And so I'm going to go out and buy some machines and start working for block rewards. And I understand that other people are doing the same thing I'm doing, and we're all in competition to earn a block reward. So it's a completely competitive market.
Exactly.
There's no perks of even when you sit back and say one company has 30% of the mining market and whatever, or there are whales out there that own a lot of Bitcoin. The reality is, no matter how much mining it is today that any one party has or any party owns, there's no ability to have any impact on
Right.
altering the governance of Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin is immutable. No one can sit back and change the rules of Bitcoin. Nobody right now has the ability to alter the ledger, to create a double spending problem, to counterfeit a Bitcoin, so that it's the one asset where ownership gives you no power over anything. So
Right.
you own it because you find utility in itself, and there are no benefit of control rights. So it's the only asset out there really where there's no benefits. If the miners, and the incentive for the miners is to not collude, to compete, because if they ever collude, if they attempt to collude, the how much money they would make in the short run by colluding would be destroyed by all the value that they would destroy as a result of colluding. So the incentive for them is never to collude, because the economics of colluding are negative. So there's a negative return to colluding. So it's the only marketplace out there where there's where you have people competing because of the protocol, the algorithm, and the algorithm is so clever in design that while it understands people have a tendency to collude to make extra profits, here's an example where the act of colluding on an expected basis would produce losses, not extra profits. So rational actors will not collude because there's a negative expected value associated with colluding. This is how ingenious the people, the person who was involved or the people involved, in whoever Satoshi is, whether it's an individual or composite of individuals, the genius of Satoshi and the genius of the white paper, and hopefully, one day the Nobel Prize Committee. I think Satoshi should get 2 Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
I think Satoshi should get the Nobel Peace Prize, because I don't think there's a greater concept for global peace, than the adoption of a Bitcoin standard, and I think Satoshi should also get a Nobel Prize for economics. So I would nominate. Not anybody gives a shit about who I would nominate, but but I would nominate Satoshi for both a Nobel Peace Prize and a Nobel Prize in economics.
I agree.
So
I agree. I think the stuff you said there is so important for people to understand, and it goes back to the proof of work concept that's forcing people to spend money, set these things up to make sure that the Bitcoin kind of ledger stays immutable, and that enough people are doing it, and that people, as the block reward go down, the holders and users of Bitcoin should, with pleasure, add transaction fees to each of their transaction, because, as you said, it's protecting themselves, and everyone is incentivized in the same way to keep Bitcoin going, to keep the success going. And you're absolutely right. If some group were to damage Bitcoin, it would just be destroying their own interests if they were miners or holders of Bitcoin. So there's really no reason to do it if you're a Bitcoin miner. And continuing with the proof of work rather than proof of stake, I think, is important. In the same way that it's very expensive to make gold, it's the amount of water used, the amount of energy used. It should be hard to make Bitcoin, and the way you make Bitcoin is through these mining facilities, and that can't change for Bitcoin to be a success. It has to stay the way it is.
I think the biggest threat, if the biggest attack threat, I think for Bitcoin is you have to think about. You always have to think as you game theory through this, you have to think about who's most damaged by the success of Bitcoin. So right now, who's most damaged by it is clear. It's not China, it's the United States. So the country, because Bitcoin is a threat to the U.S. dollar's reserve currency status. So the success of Bitcoin, the biggest loser for the success of global adoption of Bitcoin is the U.S. dollar.
Right.
So the only one who really could make a profit from changing the game theory involved in the incentives is the U.S. by controlling mining. If the CIA, or NSA, bought up all the mining and then decided to counterfeit mining for counterfeit transactions because they actually controlled the mining pools and instructed them to reverse transactions and corrupt the ledger, and then destroyed what they think is the most important competitive threat to the dollar. I think that would be the way they would do it. How the U.S. government would surreptitiously do that? Well, they probably could, but I consider that as the biggest threat is not China, is not necessarily any of these miners getting together, and colluding to destroy the value that they worked so hard to accrete. I would think would be the U.S. in attempting to do that. I think the impediment for the U.S. to do that now, politically that might be very difficult for the U.S. to do for several reasons. One is a lot of politicians now hold Bitcoin, so they won't want to destroy their own Bitcoin value. Two, to the extent that more Americans hold Bitcoin, if they destroy Bitcoin, they'll be destroying the Bitcoin for. So the way to counter the threat of the U.S. attacking Bitcoin is to continue to get more members of government, and more Americans actually holding Bitcoin, and therefore they would not want to destroy the value for so many people, because then they would not likely get reelected if they were involved in doing so. So I think it's really very, very difficult and that's why I think Bitcoin is as unstoppable as anything possibly can be unstoppable, in my opinion.
So like, as I learned from you, the kind of life cycle of a reserve currency throughout history has been maxed out about 100 years. And we're past 100 years for the U.S. being the reserve currency worldwide. So it's time for a new one to come in, and it should be Bitcoin. Bitcoin's perfectly placed for that, perfectly designed for that. And you're right. If the black ops show up at a bunch of and try to shut down all the mining sites or take control of them in the U.S., that's the nightmare scenario. But as you said, as Bitcoin makes deeper inroads with family offices, which back a lot of political campaigns, it's less and less likely. The voices of people who think that it's damaging to the energy markets are wrong. First of all, it actually is going to help them. Help the markets and help the markets grow, and actually help the infrastructure that make up the grid grow. As those voices lessen, I think that the likelihood of the U.S. stopping or taking over the mining industry goes down. So, which is what we want.
Now, there's this false claim about Bitcoin and its energy intensity, and it's destroying the planet for it's the main cause of climate change. And I know this is a conversation when I hosted that lunch that you and Bobby Kennedy had together, and I guess you had subsequent conversations with him about the energy issue. I'd like to make a couple observations and then let you talk about this in much greater depth. One is, given the fact, if you think if we take a look at the energy usage of the whole current financial system as it is composed of today, it's more energy intensive than Bitcoin is. So right now globally, we're producing a lot of shit coins that create so many perverse incentives, And instead of instead of intermediating trust, they intermediate distrust and fraud. So that right now we spend a lot of energy on a completely fraudulent system. And so to the extent that Bitcoin is used as a replacement of that, we'd actually be replacing a fraudulent system, with a trustworthy system. And by replacing it with a trustworthy system, we'd have a trustworthy system that would be less energy intensive than the untrustworthy system. So then the question is how now we're getting two benefits. We have less energy consumption, and we have a system that we can have absolute trust in, as opposed to a system that we have complete distrust in. And we should have complete distrust of the system based upon just the statements of the people who are the caretakers of it. Because when the Fed says we have a 2% inflation target, one is they don't measure inflation correctly. So the 2% number, is not necessarily a real number. And what they are guaranteeing is that whatever they print, it's the only business model out there where somebody says, I'm producing something, and at the moment I'm producing it, I'm actively working to make it worth less. So there's no business model out there where somebody says, here it is, I'm producing something on your behalf, but the minute I put it in your hand, I'm actually working to debase its value. And that's what the Fed announces, that its intention is to do that. So that's like, to me, committing a fraud. So I think from the perspective that people don't understand, it's a better use of energy to have a system of money that you can trust, that can't be debased, that's censorship resistant, that's permissionless, that's immutable, and have that replace a system that has all the vices that the current fiat paper money system has, and you'll produce less energy and more trust. That seems to be a very, very, very good, trade-off to have.
100%.
And the other thing, and then I'll turn it over to you, is now we're taking a look at, now nobody's talking about this with respect to AI. You got people out there acquiring nuclear power, and if you look at all the data centers being built and all the things to accommodate what'll probably be the most dehumanizing, Bitcoin is humanizing, okay? AI is dehumanizing. So somehow people don't have a problem with investing energy, allocating energy for such a dehumanizing technology as AI is, a technology that doesn't liberate us but enslaves us, because by nature for AI to be, the AI is better the more centralized it is. So there are economies of scale associated with AI that don't exist with Bitcoin. So if you take a look at how perverse AI is, and people going out now looking to justify build nuclear power plants, because the grid can't serve adequately the computational needs of us developing, AGI as opposed to AI. So it becomes a smarter AI, that it has generalized intelligence, not specific intelligence. That there's that you don't see all the articles about saying we're going to destroy the planet because of AI, even though AGI will consume a lot more energy than Bitcoin will consume.
Way more.
So why don't you get into this in more detail?
So I agree with everything you said, and it's funny how people pick and choose what they get upset about. If you look at cruise ships, which is just doesn't add value anywhere really. It's just a luxury thing. The amount of energy and carbon footprint that cruise ships leave is massive, and no one's out there complaining about it. And yet Bitcoin comes along, and people go crazy about the use of energy, and it's really the opposite of what people think. And going back to what you said about when you introduced me to Bobby Kennedy Jr., who's been fantastic to work with, really kept his word. We spoke about the synergistic or mutualistic relationship between renewable energy and Bitcoin mining, and we ended up working together to write a tweet that Yahoo Finance wrote an article about, and has been viewed like 760 something thousand times.
Wow.
So thank you for that introduction, and working together with him was a pleasure. So renewable energy, and focusing just for a minute on wind and solar, are propped up by federal tax subsidies, mostly called production tax credits, that incentivize people to build these wind farms. And there are not the similar incentives to build the grid up, meaning the transmission lines. So you have, particularly in Texas, but other parts too, huge number of wind farms going up with no way to get them to load pockets. Load pockets are like cities or places that need a lot of energy. So you have all this stranded wind power that's been built. The production tax credits only last for 10 years. So when you get to 11 years, the business is not propped up by the federal tax subsidies, and they have nowhere to place their power until the grid catches up and can transmit it. So you have these crazy periods, particularly in the first 10 years of a wind farm's lifespan cycle, where there's negative market prices that they have to sell into in order to continue to receive the production tax credits. So they're making wind, they're selling into the market at up to negative $27 or $30 a megawatt hour. And they're getting curtailment signals because there's nowhere to send it. So they can't even sell it at times. Either the lines are overheated or there's just no demand for it. So then this is a vital difference between AWS and AI and Bitcoin data centers. Bitcoin data centers can be co-located with these solar and wind farms. They can take all of this, what otherwise would be stranded or unused energy, allow the owners of the wind farms or solar farms to still receive their tax credits, and avoid all the negative intervals, because you can set a price that you're a willing buyer at and give them a floor price, so they're always making money. And then when the grid or the consumer demand goes up, let's say at a very hot day or during a storm like Uri, which with the big impact on the energy markets in Texas, the difference between a Bitcoin data center and AI or AWS is that a Bitcoin data center is what's called flexible interruptible. You can turn it off and then you can turn it back on with not damaging the load at all. Whereas try telling AWS, hey, we're turning off for the next 2 hours because there's consumer demand for the power. They'll lose their mind. It'll be the front page of all the newspapers and, oh, AWS had to turn off for 2 hours, or AI had to turn off. It would destroy their business. So Bitcoin can come in and be a really cooperative off-taker and a savior for the renewable energy industry, in that it can almost act as a reverse peaker plant, when they can turn off whenever demand is up and then turn on whenever the economics are so bad for the wind farm that they would lose money, and it still allow them to take the tax incentives. And then after the tax incentives are done, they'll be profitable because they can avoid all these negative intervals. And what's crazy about it is there are places in the United States where negative intervals are going to hit 30% of the time or higher. They're projected. How can you run a business when you're paying someone to take your product 30% of the time? So Bitcoin mining can come in, set a floor price, even if it's like $5 a megawatt hour. That's a massive difference between paying someone $25 a megawatt hour than receiving $5 a megawatt hour. And then whenever the local market settles above $5, the Bitcoin miner can match the local price, or when the price spikes and demand goes up, just turn off. And there's no other off-taker that can do that. So really, the relationship between renewable energy growth and Bitcoin mining is a unique one, and it's a fantastic one, and it's one that needs to be leaned into, and people need to be doing this more and more. And it serves everybody, because it gives access to cheap power for Bitcoin miners. It gives them access to green power, and it will save, I believe, it will save the renewable industry in the United States.
And how many Bitcoin miners do you see are adopting this strategy?
They're doing it. The problem is the way that electricity is traded in the United States is there are all these different zones. I mean, you probably heard of ERCOT and SPP, the Southwest Power Pool, and then you have like PJM, and there's lots of them around the United States. Some of them have not caught up yet. ERCOT has, but a lot of them do not allow a generating facility to export and import. Because when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, the Bitcoin miner has to be able to import. Because with Bitcoin mining, you got to be up 90+% of the time to pay back all this money you spent to building the data center. Right. So like the SPP, which is the Texas Panhandle, is getting destroyed. Their markets, their wind farms are hemorrhaging money. But they can't put in Bitcoin data centers right now because the data centers can't import. Otherwise, it destroys often what's called an exempt wholesale generator status. and could jeopardize a lot of the
And
subsidies.
who's preventing the importation?
These power pools that have their own regulations that in some cases are being looked at over state law. So what has to happen is these power pools, not mining pools, these power pools have to modernize and allow these sites to import on the hours when they're not generating.
Now, I guess my question, I didn't ask it very. These power pools and their governance associated with these power pools, is the governance associated with these privately owned power pools where they just have bad governance themselves, as opposed to regulations limiting what they can do?
So I think it's a combination, but I think it's more that there's these private pools that may have some state influence in them that have not modernized yet, and we're working on that with them to do it, because
so when you speak with them, I mean, you must be speaking with some of these people.
Yes.
What are they telling you? What's the rationale they're giving you on why they aren't doing this?
They are concerned that they don't fully understand the Bitcoin mining interruptibility, that at periods of high demand, the grid will still get all the power it's need. They don't understand that there are market forces here where you're able to arbitrage every 15 minutes. Energy is sold in 15-minute increments. Mm-hmm. If you set up a Bitcoin mine, and actually the end game is that these wind farms need to be vertically integrated. They need to both own the wind farm and the data center. Once they do that, they can arbitrage every 15-minute energy market interval. And by doing that, you create a more efficient market that gets power to the grid when it's needed. And these power pools don't understand that yet. They still think that all the power has to go to the grid, even during negative pricing intervals. They don't care about the curtailment signals that these generators are received to stop generating. And they don't understand that they're going to end up destroying their own industry if they don't modernize and allow these generators to also import in hours when they're not generating. And the metering can be set up in the right way so that it's done, that it's automatic, that the Bitcoin mines turn off at a certain price. And imagine if the price spikes to $200 a megawatt hour, and you can all of a sudden add more energy to the grid, that will drop the price, and that's beneficial to the end consumer. And these power pools don't seem to understand that. They're just concerned about the total amount given. They don't understand that these generators will not be able to continue on with all the negative pricing intervals down. And what they're doing is, after the 10-year period, when they no longer receive the production tax credits, they're repowering the sites, meaning building the turbines again, which can be a waste of money. These turbines can be super efficient still, but they're just spending the money to do it in order to get because once you repower, you reset the 10-year period that you can receive these production tax credits. It's a waste of money and resources. Let the production tax credits expire. Let a Bitcoin miner come in, set a floor so you're not exposed to. You get immediately in the first day, you get zero curtailment signals because you're basically routing the power right on site, and you have zero exposure to negative pricing on day one. And you don't have to.
Do you think there'd be a better partnership between alternative energy and this would also be cheaper for everyone, in the sense of, with the existence of the merger of the economics of Bitcoin production and the economics of alternative energy production, could the introduction of that type of partnership, a loose partnership, but some sort of affiliation, joint venture, or whatever, mitigate or make unnecessary the needs to even provide any tax credits to this industry, so that this industry can grow by partnering with Bitcoin miners to provide an alternative revenue stream, and that revenue stream associated with the miners would make it unnecessary for them to need any tax credits at all?
Right, 100%. Not only that, then instead of this federal tax subsidies going to incentivize people to build wind farms, we wouldn't need that anymore. More money, whether it be federal or private, could go to growing the grid. And that is ultimately, if you grow the grid and you can get the power to people who need it, it'll get all end consumers, people who, cheaper power, faster, and more of it will be green. And And that's what has to happen to improve. And then we're not so worried about someone coming in, a foreign power, and destroying our grid if we're able to increase the grid and get power to people faster.
So the irony of it is that Bitcoin mining in the U.S. could accelerate the growth of alternative energy as contributing to the grid, and it would probably happen faster if tax credits were eliminated to all these alternative energies, and then it depoliticizes alternative energy, because now the taxpayer is not subsidizing alternative energy, but its growth is a result of 100% market process.
I think so. And also, you're not wasting money on repowering when you might not have to repower. And, these turbines are so massive. That's a big spend, and that's a lot of resources that are spent on that. Look, there are two types of learning. One, when you learn something new, which is great. And then there's another when you learn something that you thought was true is not true. And I think that's the case here. We're learning that Bitcoin mining actually is a massive benefit to the United States in terms of improving potentially the grid and growing renewable energy sites in ways that don't require federal subsidies.
Right.
Because the federal subsidy at this point covers someone, and there are people who invest in production tax credits at a site, and the people who invest in the site. The people who invest in the production tax credits, they're worth about $30 a megawatt hour. So these sites are forced to continue producing, even in a market that goes to negative $30 a megawatt hour. It's just crazy. Like, they shouldn't be doing that. Like, so get someone right there who can use the power, and when the market demands more power, turn off and send it into the grid. And only Bitcoin data centers can do that. AWS can't, and AI definitely will not be able to do that. So,
and why would that not be a pitch to people for, I think overall, and at least from what I read, and I don't necessarily have inside knowledge with respect to that, but on average, it seems like in this legislature, Democrats are more hostile to Bitcoin than Republicans are. But Democrats are on average more committed to this green agenda. Okay, so why can't people sit down like you with the Democrats and say, the best way of advancing the green agenda without spending taxpayer money, is the embracement of Bitcoin, because the economics of Bitcoin converges well with the economics of alternative energy sources. So now you can have market processes producing a higher demand for alternative energy because of this partnership, and the partnership would not need, and it would be basically the economics of both Bitcoin production of mining and alternative energy production that would have them having interest in working together and collaborating. So have you or other miners attempted to have these types of conversations?
Yeah, so we're starting to, and I think I'll tell you two things about that. I think sometimes people hear what they want to hear, and they don't listen to something that they're not interested in, even though it makes sense. And they also don't want to cooperate across the aisle. I happen to be a Democrat, and I'm not a big fan of Ted Cruz, but I went to a Bitcoin Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. And Ted Cruz came and spoke. He gets it. Like, he was talking about this stuff. I'm not sure that Democrats want to admit that Ted Cruz gets it, right? And so they would rather just bang the table and say, Bitcoin's bad, and it's bad for the energy markets. It doesn't matter what the truth is necessarily, right? They don't want to be seen as agreeing with something that Ted Cruz might say. So, it's funny because when he came to speak, it was a somewhat small group that we had there, this Bitcoin Policy Summit. I didn't want to agree with him. And he went with no notes, no nothing. He did a fireside chat with one of the guys who organized this summit. And I would have said everything he said. I would have agreed with everything he said. And Texas, he's from Texas, so it's somewhat self-interested. There's a lot of wind farms and solar there. So someone got with him and spoke to him, and he got it. And he's not a dumb guy, right?
No, he isn't.
He's not. So we need more of that. I'm just not sure that, I'm from Massachusetts. I'm not sure that a Democrat from Massachusetts, where there aren't a lot of wind farms, there aren't a lot of solar farms, is going to take the time to agree with with something that they have already put out there they don't agree with, right? Like for me, I think when someone changes their opinion, when there's good value in that, and they can say, I stand corrected, I admire that. But a lot of these politicians, they don't want to ever be on record changing their opinion.
What's the conversation with like New York? I don't know if you've had conversations. I imagine like New York is a difficult market to be in. New York was one of the states that were the most difficult in granting licenses to quote crypto exchanges.
Yeah.
And I think for an obvious reason that that New York is basically the global capital of shitcoins, because it's where the money center banks are and it's where Wall Street is. So you know what would disintermediate the power of Wall Street and the bankster class, which basically resides in New York, is Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is the biggest competitive threat to both you know, Wall Street gangsters and banksters, and so the New York politicians have to protect the Wall Street gangsters and the bankster class.
That license that cost about $1 million immediately made New York a place where there's not going to be good technology innovation, not going to be the next Silicon Valley. Everyone went to Hoboken instead because the bit license just obviated any ability to do business here.
Yeah, I read that the Winklevosses had made large contributions to Cuomo's campaign, and they got their license. I'm not accusing anyone of corruption. They might just be coincidental. So, but I understood that the timing was, you know, not too far apart of the very significant contributions they made, and they were one of the few people, because I remember the reading in the beginning of the new licenses that they had like 35 applications, and they were like the first to get theirs, and only like 1 or 2 others were granted, and the others they either were rejected or they were just sitting on. So
there was a guy who was part of the New York legislature who really pushed this license through and tried to claim it would be helpful when it wasn't. I think only 3 licenses were initially granted because they were so expensive. Right after this license was approved, he quit and went to private practice to advise people on how to get this license. It's just crazy. I will say this about, it's just horrible. I will say this. The renewable energy push in New York to doing Bitcoin mining comes from the hydro up near Niagara Falls. So while they don't have the wind farms and the solar that other states might have, there's plentiful hydro because of you know, in upstate New York. And Plattsburgh, New York, at one point became like the place to go to be a Bitcoin miner because it had super cheap power due to like the proximity to Niagara Falls. And then people didn't like it because a lot of the warehouses and spaces were taking Bitcoin miners. At that time, there were 3 types of Bitcoin mine, right? There's the air-cooled with the fans. There's immersion where you just dunk them into dielectric fluid. And then there's these newer ones that are these hydro where there's a closed loop of water coming through to cool the chips and then going out to a dry cooler. At that point, the dominant player was the air-cooled ones. And they're very loud. A whole warehouses of these fans going and these bigger fans pulling the heat out of the warehouses. And the people in Plattsburgh claimed that there was a constant hum up there. So they cracked down on Bitcoin mining in Plattsburgh. But the way to unlock, I mean, I know Quebec does a lot with their hydro up in Canada for Bitcoin mining, but New York could do a lot more with the hydro they have here to become kind of a center of Bitcoin mining, and they're just not welcoming. And hydro can be, you know, it's somewhat seasonal in terms of water flow, but you could get a 24-hour pull from hydro, whereas obviously wind you get about 11 hours a day. Solar you get about 7 hours a day. So hydro in some sense is the holy grail, but my focus is on wind and solar because I think the mutualistic relationship between Bitcoin mining and wind and solar is just so obvious and has to be leaned into. Look, someone needs to go out and for pennies on the dollar, buy up all the struggling wind and solar sites that are 11 years old, and then vertically integrate them with Bitcoin mining data centers, and force the jurisdictions of that electricity region to allow for import and export at the same site. For me, that's the holy grail, getting vertically integrated. And you can go from, these wind farms and solar sites are probably happy to get $35 a megawatt hour on average, $40. And if you will get vertically integrated with Bitcoin mining, you can probably make north of 150 on a, that's a tremendous difference. And people are spending huge money on batteries power to help try to time the market correctly, so that when the prices are negative, you charge the batteries and then you release the power when prices go up. But that only gives you like a 2 to 4 hour window to play the market, whereas a Bitcoin data center allows you to arbitrage every 15-minute interval that you're producing power.
Is that something you're working on doing?
Yeah.
And what kind of resistance, when you make this pitch to people, what kind of resistance are you? How much capital do you need to do to accomplish something like this?
Yeah, so I have a friend who used to work for, I think it was Warren Buffett, had a huge amount of wind farms, and he was the CEO of one group of them. And he's thinking about trying to, we were talking about raising $500 million to go buy a bunch of distressed wind farms. The more distressed, the better. And what's interesting about it is that there are USDA-backed guaranteed loans at like prime +2, like 65 to 70% LTV that can help you buy these sites, and can help build the Bitcoin mine because it's part of the CNI loan that USDA provides for the building of infrastructure on a wind farm. So I think that would be a plan to go raise that and then lead into these USDA loans to go buy these sites. I'm speaking now with some people who own wind farms in the Texas Panhandle. There's one lawyer who kind of knows more than others in Texas who can help us try to see if there's a way around this import-export rule. The SPP has their headquarters in Kansas City. We're thinking about arranging a meeting with the heads of SPP to kind of explain to them why they should at least let us do a pilot program at some sites in SPP to show them how this works. We're working on it. I'm hopeful.
This is something that my next trip to New York, if it's something is still a work in process and progress, we can sit down and have a more elaborate conversation about that. I might have a personal interest. I'm always.
I could think of no better partner. There's no better partner than you. I mean, we're both Bitcoin maxis, and yeah, that would be amazing.
So why don't we? I'll let you know the next time I come to New York, so we can have a conversation about this. That sounds very interesting. I've always been very reluctant to do anything that involves any government subsidy or any conversation with government. I mean, so I never like a business that requires a government subsidy. I never like a business where the economics that the government subsidy, a government tax credit, is something that is part of the economics. That's why I would never do like a Tesla. I would never want to produce a product where I got to go to the government and say, please give me tax credits to stimulate demand. So, it's hard to ask the government to leave you alone if you're asking something of the government. So if you're not leaving the government alone, you shouldn't expect to be left alone. I want to be left alone. So I want I want to leave the government alone, and I want them to leave me alone. So I don't really like to do anything where, you're interacting with the government. But I do think this is a very, compelling presentation. And I think, if we think about how people are so receptive to this AI, where you have to go out and build nuclear power facilities that people haven't liked to have in their backyards, and people supposedly are all these concerns about climate change and want the solution to be alternative energy. And the best way to accelerate it without requiring a lot more government investment is through marrying, the marriage between, Bitcoin and mining and alternative energy, that a market process could produce an outcome, much better for society in many ways.
So,
in having less environmental degradation without having the government to have any involvement in that. and having a currency that is the most honest, most trustworthy currency on the only honest ledger, that exists. Some people might say, one person commented about they can keep their gold, and this one said gold is at 2750. Who gives a shit that Bitcoin is at 66,000? When I like to give as a frame of reference, when I was interviewed in the end of February, early March of 2020, by Cheryl Atkinson on her program Full Measure. I think Bitcoin was about 8,000 and gold was about 1,600 or so, and so Bitcoin is now 66,000, 67,000. Gold's at 2750. So I think I would prefer, for every dollar invested, I would prefer to have it invested in the appreciation you get in Bitcoin versus the appreciation you got in gold. This person could say, okay, keep your stinking Bitcoin. Yes, I plan on doing that. And they can keep their gold, and they can keep getting poorer relative to me as time passes. So if they get utility from doing that, go ahead, do that. I used to be a gold person until Bitcoin came along, and the attributes of Bitcoin are so much better than gold. One is the peculiar thing about gold, and I once actually tried to design a token that would tokenize gold, that the token would be designed in a way that would make it unnecessary to actually extract the gold, because most of the environmental degradation of gold is the extraction process. So if we take a look at gold mining, you have the reserves out there. You have the reserves in the mine. If you think about what we do with gold, we take gold out, we extract it, we make it look nice, right? And then we put it back underground. Yeah. So all we're doing, the making it look pretty increases the aesthetic quality of the gold, but it doesn't increase the value of the gold itself. So if I had claims against proven or probable or possible reserves, and I had a token that represented a claim against that, then I would never need to extract it, because I would only need to extract the gold that's useful for commercial applications. And most of the gold is not used for commercial applications. Most of the gold is used, as money. So the central banks would not need to extract gold. They would not need to then warehouse them. They would just get a receipt against reserves in a gold mine. That have to be a proof of making sure that there would not be counterfeit. So you'd have to look at how the consensus mechanism of how that token is produced, but you can create a process for some sort of validation to give some trust into the fact that there were no duplicate gold receipts given out, and then you would never need to extract it all. So, but right now, if you think about, accumulating, gold as a store of value, it's expensive to store. It's not portable at all. If we think about good money, good money is cheap to store and is very portable. Gold is not very portable, and gold is not cheap to store, and you basically have to rely upon third parties to store it. So again, if you're not the custody of it, it's not really yours. So, and the government knows who the custodies of them are. The government has confiscated gold. It's a lot easier to confiscate gold than it is to confiscate somebody's Bitcoin wallet.
The flea factor between Bitcoin and gold is you can't even talk about, because you can just, as long as you can convey to someone your 24-word code somewhere, you can reconstitute your wallet wherever you want. And also, Bitcoin's divisible in ways that you don't damage the rest of it. Whereas you can't chop up your Bitcoin, your gold coin, take a potato peeler to your gold bar. It's just not comparable. But to go back to something you said about AI, how people aren't kind of upset about the environmental impact and the use of energy. AI is controlled by major companies that can run PR campaigns and can have articles published on it. Bitcoin being decentralized and there's no one really running it, doesn't have someone to spearhead the PR campaign that, hey, we're not bad for the environment. Hey, We're going to replace all this other legacy stuff that's wasting energy. So that's why Bitcoin is getting this bad reputation, whereas AI doesn't suffer the same, because of how decentralized and great Bitcoin is, right? Whereas AI is artificially propping up their image by saying, hey, we're going to be great, and don't worry about all the fact that we're going to take up every last bit of energy in the United States, right? That's the difference.
Yes. That's an excellent point. I have one more question to ask you, if it's a topic that you want to discuss or not discuss at all, is, the importance of, the participation you have as a Bitcoin miner into a proof of work consensus mechanism. Do you want to talk a little about the importance of is that something you feel comfortable talking about, proof of work consensus mechanism, or you don't really feel comfortable talking?
Well, I mean, in terms of the difference between proof of work and proof of stake, like, again, proof of work requires someone to put real effort in to make the Bitcoin. And I think that's an important part of it, that if you're not required to really make an effort in and be committed to the process, then there's less value in what you're doing. And I think we're seeing that in the way that the United States is taking the lead in Bitcoin mining. People are really pushing forward. I think that the proof of work in the way that we're going to optimize the use of energy has a benefit outside of Bitcoin. I don't know if that really answers your question, but Bitcoin doesn't work if it's not proof of work, right? You can't go to proof of stake. It has to be proof of work. You have to kind of have this, like, network out there of people ensuring the kind of quality of all the previous transactions and the ledger being out there. And that's maybe not the best answer in the world, but it's kind of the way that I look at it.
That's well put. Is there anything? How would you like to conclude this conversation, Daniel? What would be your last messages that you would like to communicate to anyone who is watching now or who might be watching later?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bitcoin, is a world changer. When the internet first came out, people didn't really understand how it would affect our lives, and it's massively changed the way that we pass information around the world. People still don't understand the impact Bitcoin's going to have. It's going to reduce corruption around the world. It's going to be the way that wealth, or not wealth, but value is transferred around the world. Everyone should own some Bitcoin. And what's important is you don't have to buy a Bitcoin, right? You can buy just a little bit of it. And buying a little bit of it allows you to have some interest in it. And maybe you'll read articles with a more open mind. You'll start understanding it better. I'm a real believer that Bitcoin is going to change the world. We've referenced a couple of times shitcoins and things like that. I'm really a Bitcoin maxi. I think Bitcoin has a chance to change the way that banking systems kind of destroy people's lives, change the way, real estate is transferred. If you thought, people, when Bitcoin hit 1,000, everyone was like, oh my God, I missed my chance to buy Bitcoin. When Bitcoin hit 10,000, people were like, oh my God, I missed my chance to buy Bitcoin. You haven't missed your chance. There's still so much room here, in my view, obviously, I believe this, to go. You don't have to buy a Bitcoin. Just buy $100, $1,000. Just get involved somehow, and I think you'll be better for it.
So, excellent final words, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation, Daniel. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I look forward for us to get together next time in New York and talk more about the projects you're working on.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I enjoy speaking to you every time. I'm a big admirer, so I had a great time. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, have a great day. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Likewise. Bye.
Bye.